The Westbrook subdivision existed in a pocket of calculated perfection, the kind of neighborhood where HOA violations arrived on cream-colored cardstock and paint colors were debated at monthly meetings as if they carried geopolitical consequences. Sarah Chen had lived here for 8 years, ever since she and Marcus bought the corner lot on Maple Drive with the promise of building their life into something solid and respectable. She'd kept her promise. The house was immaculate, a craftsman colonial painted in approved sand drift beige, the lawn maintained by a service that understood the obsessive precision the neighborhood demanded. Their 2 kids, Emma and Jack, had grown up in these streets, attending the excellent schools, making friends in the carefully manicured parks, learning to navigate a world where appearance was everything. But appearance, Sarah had come to understand, was a mask that could slip at any moment. And when it did, the neighborhood showed its teeth. The pool had been Marcus's idea, not the addition to their backyard. That had been practical, a reasonable investment. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was the astronomical cost or the way the construction would drag on for months, consuming their savings and their peace of mind. When it was finally finished 2 summers ago, Sarah remembered standing at the edge of the sparkling water, trying to feel the joy she was supposed to feel. Mostly, she felt exhausted. The Hendersons lived 3 houses down. Brad Henderson was the HOA president, a title he wore like a crown, a visible manifestation of his God-given right to oversee the moral and aesthetic decisions of 247 other families. His wife, Diane, had perfected the art of the casual cruelty. She was blonde, perpetually tanned, married to a man who made twice what Marcus did, and she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. They had a daughter, Christina, who was Jack's age. They'd been in the same class since 2nd grade. It started in early June, right after school let out. Sarah was in the kitchen when Emma came inside, her wet swimsuit dripping pool water onto the tile floor. "Mom, Christina's here. Can she swim?" Sarah looked up from the chopped vegetables she was preparing for dinner. Christina stood in the doorway, still in her school clothes, eyeing their pool like it was the gates of heaven. "Of course," Sarah said, smiling. "Tell her to grab one of our suits. There's a pile in the pool house." It became routine. 3 days a week, sometimes 4, Christina would appear in their backyard with Emma, and they'd spend the afternoon in the water while Sarah brought out snacks and kept a careful eye on them. It was harmless, she told herself. It was what good neighbors did. It was what kind people did. The first sign that this wasn't reciprocated came in late June, when Sarah asked if Jack could swim at the Hendersons' pool. A massive resort-style installation with a water slide that made her own pool look like a kiddie bath by comparison. "Oh," Diane said, cornering Sarah at the mailbox one morning, all syrup and poison. "We try to keep it as just family time, you know. We don't really have the neighbors over. I hope Christina hasn't been imposing on you too much." Sarah felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate, imposing, as if her daughter had been forcing her way into their home. "It's no trouble," Sarah said carefully. "We enjoy having her." Diane smiled, the kind of smile that was really a warning. "You're so sweet. We're just very particular about who's in our space. I'm sure you understand." After that, Sarah should have said no. She should have told Emma that Christina couldn't come anymore, that the dynamic had shifted, that this was no longer kind. It was one-sided. But she didn't. Instead, she kept the pool gate open, kept the suits washed and ready, kept smiling at Diane at the mailbox even though each interaction felt like a small cut. Throughout July, it became a daily thing. Christina would show up, sometimes with her mother watching from their yard, and use Sarah's pool. Sarah started tracking it in her mind, not bitterly, she told herself, just practically. She'd bought more towels. She'd had to shock the pool twice because of the increased usage. She'd invested in better chlorine dispensers. The expense was mounting. More than that, the resentment was mounting. Came to a head on a Thursday afternoon in early August. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard voices outside, not just Christina and Emma, but other voices. She went to the window and saw that the Henderson family had organized a full pool day. Brad was lounging on one of their lounge chairs. Diane was in the water with Christina and 2 other kids from the neighborhood, kids Sarah hadn't invited. There was a cooler on the deck. They'd brought their own supplies, which somehow made it worse. They weren't even asking permission. They were simply occupying her space. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She went outside. "Hi," she called out, her voice tight. "I didn't know we had this planned." Diane emerged from the water like Venus, water streaming off her skin, completely at ease. "Oh, Brad wanted to see your pool. Christina's been telling him about it. We thought we'd make a family day of it. I hope you don't mind." Mind, such a small word, such a loaded word. "Actually," Sarah said, "it's not a good day, we have plans." Brad stood up from the lounge chair, his body language suddenly territorial, as if Sarah had challenged his authority. "Come on, we're just neighbors having fun, don't be that way." That way, as if wanting privacy in her own home was petulant, as if her property rights existed only as long as they were convenient to others. "I'd like you to leave," Sarah said quietly. The afternoon fractured. Diane's face shifted from patronizing to contemptuous. Brad muttered something under his breath about certain people not understanding community. The kids looked confused and embarrassed. Christina climbed out of the pool, and for a moment, Sarah felt a flash of guilt at the girl's disappointed face, but it wasn't enough to override the fury coursing through her. She watched as they left, as Brad gathered up their things with exaggerated slowness, as Diane said something to another neighbor that made them both laugh and look back at Sarah's house. The retaliation came subtly at first. An email from Brad, copied to the entire HOA mailing list, noting that the Henderson residents had received 3 noise complaints about a pool party and reminding all homeowners of the covenant restrictions on gatherings and amplified music. There had been no party at Sarah's house. There had been no music, but the implication was clear. She was the problem. Then came the inspection. Brad showed up on a Saturday morning with his clipboard and his official HOA demeanor, pointing out that the pool deck's non-slip coating was showing wear in one corner and that this constituted a safety violation. He cited the handbook. He took photographs. He gave Sarah a deadline, 48 hours to remedy the situation or face a fine. The non-slip coating issue would cost $3,000 to fix. Sarah didn't have $3,000. Not easily. Not without arguing with Marcus, who was already stressed about work, already worried about money, already distant in the way men sometimes became when they sensed financial tension. She paid for the repair herself, charging it to a credit card and telling Marcus it was something that needed to be done. He didn't push. He was working too much to pay attention. But the violations kept coming. An HOA notice about the landscaping not meeting the community standards for intentional design. A follow-up about the color of her front door, apparently warm taupe, wasn't the exact shade that had been approved, and while it was close wasn't good enough. A violation for grass that was half an inch too tall, for a tree branch that extended slightly into the sight line of a neighbor's driveway. Each violation came with a fine, $50 here, $100 there. Each one was a small knife wound designed to irritate rather than kill, but collectively they were bleeding her out. Sarah knew exactly who was orchestrating this. Brad had the power, but Diane had the motivation. Every time Sarah saw Diane at the mailbox or at the grocery store, there was that small smile, that raised eyebrow, the look of someone enjoying revenge. The neighborhood dynamic began to shift. Sarah started noticing that when she walked to the mailbox, other neighbors would watch from their windows. Conversations that had once included her seemed to pause when she approached. The casual Friday evening gatherings she and Marcus used to attend became events they weren't invited to. It was being erased, slowly and methodically, from the social fabric of the place where she lived. In late August, Emma came home from a playdate at a friend's house, and Sarah could tell something was wrong. Her daughter's eyes were red, and she was moving slowly, deliberately, the way kids did when they'd been hurt. "What happened?" Sarah asked, kneeling down to Emma's level. "Christina said." Emma's voice was small. "She said that Mommy was being mean to her family, and that's why she couldn't come to the pool anymore. And then the other kids said, they said it was because we were mean, because we think we're better than everyone." Sarah's heart shattered. She pulled Emma into a hug, feeling the girl's body go stiff with the effort of not crying. "That's not true, baby," Sarah whispered. "That's not true at all." But the damage was done. Emma had internalized it the way children did. She became withdrawn, stopped asking to go to playdates, started staying inside more. Jack noticed too. He came home from basketball at the park one afternoon and reported that Brad Henderson had told him he needed to encourage his mom to be a better neighbor. A 10-year-old had been recruited as a messenger for this vendetta. Marcus finally asked about it one night in September, after he'd received an email from Brad regarding some issue with the pool equipment being visible from the street. They were in bed, and Marcus was staring at the ceiling in the dark. "What's going on with the Hendersons?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure how to explain it, how to describe the way one small act of boundaries had spiraled into a calculated campaign of social and financial harassment. How to tell her husband that her act of saying no had cost them thousands of dollars and the peace of their children. "I told them Christina couldn't swim here anymore," she finally said. "They didn't like it." "Why would you do that?" Marcus's voice held no anger, just confusion. "That seems like it's causing more problems than it would have solved." Sarah sat up. "Because they were using our pool without asking, without contributing, without ever offering the same courtesy back. Because Diane made it clear their daughter would never be welcome in their home, and I was tired of being treated like our generosity was something owed to them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe you should apologize," he said quietly. "I don't like the energy that's coming from that direction. It's affecting the neighborhood, and it's affecting us." "I'm not apologizing," Sarah said. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not," Marcus said. "But you did something they didn't like, and they have more power in this neighborhood than we do." The truth of it hung between them. Power. That was what this really was about. Sarah had challenged the hierarchy, questioned the unspoken rules of deference that kept neighborhoods like this running smoothly. And now she was being punished for forgetting her place. In early October, a notice arrived. The Hendersons were installing a second pool, a massive resort-style lagoon with water slides and a hot tub and a grotto feature. The construction would begin in 2 weeks. The notice came from the county, but Sarah knew Brad had rushed the approvals through. The message was unmistakable. They were going to build something so spectacular that Sarah's modest pool would become a relic, a reminder of her inadequacy. She stood in her backyard that evening, looking at her pool, the source of all this conflict, the reason this had started, the thing that had somehow become both a gift and a curse. The water was clear and pristine. It was a nice pool. Emma and Jack had had good summers here. It didn't matter that it was nice. In Westbrook, there was always someone with something nicer, and if you tried to keep what you had to yourself, they would take it as a personal offense. The construction on the Henderson pool began in mid-October. Machinery arrived, massive pieces of earth-moving equipment that dwarfed the neighborhood street. The Henderson backyard became a construction zone, complete with workers, dust, and the persistent sound of bulldozers and dump trucks. The neighborhood, which had always prided itself on tranquility, became a place of constant disruption. And Brad Henderson made no apologies for it. If anything, he seemed to relish the controlled chaos. Sarah watched from her own yard as he stood with the construction crew, pointing and gesturing, clearly enjoying his role as the man whose family was important enough to warrant this kind of disruption. Inconvenience be damned. The violation notices continued to arrive. Now there were complaints about the pool equipment creating an eyesore, about drainage concerns, about a violation of some subsection of the HOA covenant that Sarah had never heard of. Each one came with a fine. Each fine was another small bleed of money and dignity. Marcus was working longer hours, staying late at the office, avoiding conversations about the situation. When he was home, there was a tension between them that hadn't existed before. Sarah could see it in the way he looked at the house, the way his eye caught on every imperfection, every evidence of their failure to maintain the facade. In early November, Sarah was at the grocery store when she ran into Patricia Liang, another neighbor who lived 2 blocks over. Patricia had always been kind, had invited Sarah to book club meetings and holiday parties. They'd never been close, but they'd been friendly enough. Patricia's face shifted when she saw Sarah, a micro-expression of discomfort, followed by an attempt to recover. "Sarah, hi," Patricia said, but she was already moving away, already angling toward the produce section. "I'd love to chat, but I'm in a bit of a rush." Sarah understood. Patricia was choosing sides. Or rather, Patricia was recognizing that Sarah had lost and that associating with the loser would reflect poorly on her own standing in the community. This was how hierarchies operated, not through open violence or declared wars, but through the slow, methodical withdrawal of social connection, through the reduction of your existence until you were essentially alone in a place where you'd once belonged. Emma's school grades started slipping. Jack stopped asking about the school basketball team. Both kids were eating less, sleeping poorly, displaying the physical manifestations of anxiety that Sarah recognized because she was experiencing them too. She was having trouble concentrating at work. She was a medical billing specialist. a job that required precision but that she could do on autopilot, which meant she was increasingly prone to mistakes. Marcus confronted her about it in early November. They were in the kitchen and he'd just gotten off the phone with work. His face was rigid. "They're putting me on probation," he said quietly. "My performance has been suffering. They asked if everything was okay at home." Sarah felt something inside her crack. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean for this to affect." "The Hendersons are having a dinner party this Friday," Marcus interrupted. "Brad invited me, said he wanted to talk about some investment opportunity, something that could be really good for both of us." Sarah stared at him. "Are you going to go?" Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. "I think I have to. Work has been rough. If Brad can introduce me to someone who might help me get back on track, I have to take that seriously." "They're doing this on purpose," Sarah said. "They're isolating me by pulling you in. They're using this to separate us." "Or," Marcus said quietly, "maybe I should try to fix what you broke." The words landed like a slap. Sarah felt her breath catch, felt the sting of betrayal, even though she understood the pressure he was under. She understood that she had created this situation, that her refusal to let Christina use their pool had somehow cascaded into a full-scale neighborhood civil war. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. Marcus went to the dinner party on Friday night. He came home after 11 and Sarah pretended to be asleep. In the morning, he reported that it had been nice, that Brad had indeed mentioned an investment opportunity, something legitimate, something that could help their financial situation. He said they'd been kind. He said he felt like things might be turning around. He said it carefully, as if he was asking permission to hope. Sarah nodded and said that was wonderful. The next week, Brad appeared at their door on a Saturday morning. He was in casual clothes, expensive casual, the kind that cost more money than Sarah's work wardrobe, and he was carrying his official HOA clipboard. "Got a minute?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I just wanted to do a routine safety inspection, noticed some concerns with the pool area." He was making a show of it, Sarah realized. He wanted her to see him there, wanted the neighbors to see him there, wanted to reinforce her status as someone being monitored, someone who couldn't be trusted. He walked around the pool, making notes on his clipboard. He pointed out a crack in the coping that Sarah hadn't noticed. He mentioned that the drain grate didn't meet current safety specifications. He noted that the pool chemistry readings, posted on the gate as required, seemed irregular, suggesting possible maintenance issues. "Nothing critical," he said with false warmth. "Just things that should be addressed. I'll send over the details and you can take care of them. Shouldn't be too expensive." He was lying. They would be expensive. Sarah could feel it. Every recommendation he made would carry a price tag, another drain on their resources, another way to demonstrate that her home was no longer her own, that it belonged to the consensus of the neighborhood, to their rules, their standards, their judgment. "Thank you," she heard herself say, her voice hollow. After Brad left, Sarah sat by the pool for a long time. The water was still, reflecting the gray November sky. She thought about that first moment when Marcus had suggested building it, when they'd thought it would be a source of joy, a place where their kids would make memories, a symbol of their arrival into a stable, respectable middle-class life. Instead, it had become a battlefield. It had become a reason for her to be punished. It had become the thing that was destroying her family. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah went to the pool house and found the drain valve. It was meant for routine maintenance, for controlled emptying when chemicals needed to be adjusted or the pool needed deep cleaning. She'd never used it, but she knew how it worked. Marcus had shown her during the orientation when they'd first installed the system. She turned it slightly, testing it. A small stream of water began flowing out through the drainage pipe. She closed it again and walked inside, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was thinking. She knew it was a fantasy, a moment of desperate desperation, a passing thought born of exhaustion and pain. But the seed had been planted, and it would grow. The Hendersons' new pool was completed in late November. Its grand opening happened on a Saturday afternoon, Thanksgiving weekend, when most of the neighborhood was home to witness the event. Brad and Diane had invited the entire neighborhood for a pool party, a carefully calculated move designed to emphasize their superiority and Sarah's irrelevance. Sarah watched from her bedroom window as neighbors filed into the Henderson backyard. She recognized most of them, people she'd smiled at for 8 years, people she'd thought were her friends. They all seemed eager, excited about the spectacle of the new pool. Some of them glanced toward Sarah's house with a mix of pity and schadenfreude. Emma was in her room reading. Jack was in the basement playing video games. Neither of them had been invited to the opening. Neither of them were asking to go. The humiliation of exclusion had become their new normal. Marcus came into the bedroom, dressed for the party. "I have to go," he said quietly. "Brad specifically asked me to come. I told him I would." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. If she spoke, she would say things that couldn't be unsaid, things that would accelerate the dissolution of their marriage. "I know this is hard," Marcus said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "But I have to try to fix this. My career is on the line, and if the Hendersons are willing to help." "By humiliating us," Sarah finally said. "By making sure everyone in the neighborhood knows that we've been defeated." "By offering an olive branch," Marcus said. "By suggesting that maybe we can move past this." "There is nothing to move past," Sarah said. "I stood up for myself one time, and they decided to destroy me for it." Marcus left the room without responding. Sarah heard the front door close. She watched from the window as he walked down the street to the Henderson house, and she felt something inside her calcify. Her husband was choosing them. Her children had lost their place in the neighborhood. She was being systematically erased. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe. That night after Marcus came home, late, happy, talking about the incredible pool and the really nice people at the party, Sarah lay awake and made a decision. It wasn't a sudden decision born of a moment of rage. It was a decision that had been forming for months, crystallizing through every violation, every humiliation, every small betrayal. If they wanted to destroy her, she would give them a reason to regret it. She started planning in earnest. She researched the pool system, learned about the chemicals, understood the mechanics. She looked up the codes and regulations, the engineering specs. She calculated the amount of time it would take to fully drain the Hendersons' new pool using the valve connection between the systems. Yes, the systems were connected. The Hendersons' construction had required routing a line to the city's main drain, and for cost efficiency, Brad had approved a connection to Sarah's existing drainage system. It was a minor architectural decision made months ago, when Sarah and Brad were still friendly, when no one had anticipated this war. The irony was almost beautiful. Sarah checked the blueprints that Brad had proudly shared months ago when the plans were being reviewed by the HOA. The connection was indeed there, clearly marked. She took photographs of her own drainage system, of the valve that controlled the flow. She researched the timing, how long it would take, what the volume would be, what the consequences would be. She prepared, not physically, not yet, but mentally. She rehearsed the moment in her mind, playing it over and over until she could see every detail with perfect clarity. She imagined the water draining. She imagined Brad's face when he realized what was happening. She imagined Diane's expression shifting from triumph to devastation. The revenge fantasy sustained her through Thanksgiving. It carried her through the emails that kept arriving, the violation notices that somehow kept multiplying despite the corrective actions she'd taken. It gave her something to hold on to while her marriage continued its slow dissolve, while her children retreated further into themselves, while the neighborhood finished closing ranks against her. By early December, the Hendersons' new pool had become the crown jewel of Westbrook. Photos appeared on the neighborhood Facebook page. Brad hosted a work event there. Diane mentioned it casually to Sarah at the mailbox. "You really should come over and see it sometime," as if Sarah hadn't been explicitly and systematically excluded from everything. Sarah smiled and nodded and felt the rage burning hotter. She told Marcus that she needed a weekend away, that she was exhausted and needed some space to think. He agreed almost too quickly, relieved perhaps that she was taking her problems somewhere else. She booked a hotel room in the city for a Friday night, packed a bag, made sure the plan was set. But on Thursday evening, something happened that changed everything. Emma came home from school with a note from her teacher. Sarah opened it with the dull anxiety that had become her constant companion and found that it was a notification about Emma's declining academic performance. The teacher was concerned. Emma seemed withdrawn, anxious. There was a recommendation for counseling. Sarah sat down on the couch and wept. She had done this. In her quest for justice, in her desire to punish the people who had wronged her, she had created collateral damage. Her daughter was suffering. Her family was fracturing, and everyone she hated was fine. They were thriving. They had a new pool and a respected place in the community and lives that continued on, unaffected by the war that was consuming Sarah. That night she lay in bed and thought about revenge. She thought about the valve, the timing, the perfect symmetry of it. She thought about Brad discovering his new pool draining, about the expense, about the humiliation of having something destroyed. But she also thought about Jack, asking if Daddy was still upset with Mommy. She thought about Emma, who had stopped painting because she said there was no point in making anything pretty. She thought about Marcus, who looked at her now with a mixture of pity and resentment. She thought about the fact that destroying their pool wouldn't fix any of this. It wouldn't make her daughter feel better. It wouldn't bring her marriage back. It wouldn't restore her standing in the neighborhood. It would only make her someone who damaged other people's property, someone who could be arrested, someone who confirmed every negative thing that had been said about her. Friday morning, Sarah called in to work and said she wasn't feeling well. She called the hotel and canceled her reservation. She was trying to decide whether to call Marcus and tell him she was going to stay home when her phone rang. It was the hospital. Brad Henderson had been in an accident. He'd been working on some electrical issue with the new pool's pumping system, apparently ignoring safety protocols. He'd been electrocuted. He was alive but critical. He was in the ICU. The neighborhood held its breath. Then it exhaled with a strange mixture of shock and schadenfreude. Brad had always been the untouchable one, the man with power, and now he was suddenly vulnerable. Sarah felt the weight of it lift slightly. The universe had intervened. She didn't have to destroy the pool. She didn't have to become the villain. Fate had done it for her. But then the realization hit her. The accident meant that Brad's attention would be elsewhere, which meant the violation notices would stop, which meant that Sarah's punishment would cease, not because she'd fought back, but because her tormentor was incapacitated. She hadn't won. She'd simply been saved by luck. Brad was in the hospital for 6 weeks. The recovery was slow and brutal. He'd suffered serious burns, nerve damage to his right arm, and the kind of psychological trauma that comes from nearly being killed by your own pride. When he finally came home, he was a different man, quieter, diminished, marked by the kind of physical change that made him impossible to ignore. The violation notices stopped immediately. The HOA committee continued to function, but without Brad's orchestrating vendetta at its center, it became what it was meant to be, a mundane administrative body handling actual code issues, not personal vendettas. The neighborhood returned to a kind of peace, though an uneasy one. Sarah attended the neighborhood welcome back gathering for Brad with something close to relief. She kept her distance, of course, but she was there, she was visible, she was not hiding. When Diane saw her, there was a moment of something unreadable in her expression. Guilt, maybe, pity, the knowledge that she'd been the architect of all this and that it had been revealed as somehow hollow, somehow incomplete. Christina started spending time at the park again, and one afternoon, Emma went to play there and came home talking about how they'd played together, how Christina had actually apologized for the things she'd said. Children were better at forgiveness than adults, Sarah realized. They could move on faster, could compartmentalize easier. Marcus seemed relieved by the cessation of conflict. His work performance improved. He stopped attending social gatherings at the Hendersons' house. Brad's injury had made those gatherings awkward and inappropriate. Slowly, incrementally, some of the tension in their marriage began to ease. But things didn't return to what they'd been. They couldn't. Sarah had tasted the depth of her own fury, had held in her hands the knowledge of exactly how to destroy the people who had wronged her. That knowledge didn't disappear. It lived in her, a permanent presence, a understood capability. One evening in early January, Sarah was alone in the pool house. She was replacing the filter on the drainage system, a routine maintenance task. She found herself looking at the valve again, running her hand along its metal surface. She thought about that night when she'd turned it experimentally, when she'd tested the fantasy. She thought about how close she'd come. There was a knock on the door. Sarah turned to find Marcus standing there, holding 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you might want a break," he said, offering her one. They stood together in the pool house, looking out at the backyard, at the pool that had started all this, that had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly, "for choosing them over you, for wanting you to apologize instead of fighting back." "I almost did something really stupid," Sarah said. She hadn't planned to tell him. The words came out unbidden. Marcus looked at her. "What do you mean?" She told him about the valve, about the connected drainage system, about the detailed plan she'd constructed for draining the Hendersons' pool. She told him how close she'd come to actually doing it, about how the only thing that had stopped her was the realization of what it would cost her family. Marcus was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I," Sarah said. "But I hate that part of me wanted to. I hate that they brought me to that place." "They did," Marcus said. "And I should have protected you from it, should have recognized what was happening and shut it down earlier." They stood together in silence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The pool was still, reflecting the color perfectly. It was beautiful in a way that wasn't connected to status or comparison or hierarchy. It was just a pool full of water, a place where their kids could swim. Sarah thought about Brad, recovering in his house, his arm still in a sling, his confidence shattered. She thought about Diane, who had orchestrated all of this, only to have it come to nothing. She thought about the unfairness of it all, the way power in suburbs like Westbrook was so fragile and so absolute simultaneously. She raised her glass to Marcus. "To letting go," she said. He clinked his glass against hers. "To forgetting," he said. They both knew they wouldn't forget, but the gesture mattered, the attempt to move forward mattered. Over the following months, life in Westbrook gradually normalized. Brad returned to some of his HOA duties, but with less intensity, less poison. There were no more violation notices. The neighborhood settled into a kind of truce, not friendliness exactly, but the absence of active hostility. Emma's grades improved. Jack rejoined the basketball team. Sarah stopped researching pool drainage systems and started reading books for pleasure again. She and Marcus took a weekend trip to the beach without the kids, and for the first time in months, they laughed together without tension underneath it. But something had changed permanently. Sarah was no longer fully invested in belonging to Westbrook. She saw the neighborhood now as what it was, a collection of people trying to maintain an illusion of permanence and control in a world where neither of those things were guaranteed. The HOA rules seemed petty to her now. The social hierarchy seemed fragile and artificial. She started looking at houses online. Not aggressively, just casually. Homes in different neighborhoods, different towns. Places where people weren't neighbors, weren't in constant judgment of one another, weren't waiting for an excuse to deploy cruelty. In April, on a warm Saturday afternoon, Sarah was working in her garden. Just her garden, not the meticulously landscaped yard that the HOA had demanded, when Diane appeared at the fence line. It was the first direct conversation they'd had since the incident. "I wanted to apologize," Diane said quietly. There was no performative warmth in her voice, no false brightness, just weariness. "Okay," Sarah said, not particularly interested in absolving her. "What happened with Brad? I realized that we'd gone too far, that I'd gone too far. The accident made me think about how arbitrary all of this is, how meaningless." Sarah thought about the months of harassment, about her daughter's anxiety, about the poisoning of her marriage. She thought about how close she'd come to doing something that would have destroyed her life. "It was cruel," Sarah said simply. "I know," Diane said. "I'm sorry." They stood there for a moment, two women separated by a fence, both of them changed by circumstances neither had anticipated. "I'm leaving," Sarah said. She hadn't told Marcus this yet, but saying it out loud made it real. "We're moving, probably this summer." Diane nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this, as if the neighborhood had claimed another victim, pushed another family to the margins until they had no choice but to leave. "I hope you find somewhere better," Diane said. Sarah didn't respond. She simply turned back to her garden and waited for Diane to leave. After a few moments, she heard footsteps retreating, and she was alone again with the earth and the plants and the knowledge that sometimes the only way to win was to stop playing the game entirely. That night, Sarah dreamed of water draining. In the dream, she was standing at the valve, turning it with purpose, watching the Hendersons' perfect pool empty completely. But in the dream, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like loss. It felt like joining them in the cycle of destruction and revenge. The new house was in a different suburb, a less organized place where the HOA had actual rules about necessary things, safety codes, structural standards, and didn't interfere in the minutiae of personal choice. There was no community pool, which seemed fitting somehow. Sarah had kept the Westbrook house listed through the sale. The new owners were a younger family, not yet jaded by the illusions of suburban perfection. Sarah imagined them discovering the violation notices, the unspoken social codes, the way the neighborhood operated. She wondered if they would be crushed by it or if they would navigate it better. She didn't think about it much, though. She was too busy being happy. Emma was doing better at her new school. She'd made friends with kids who didn't define her by her parents' social standing. Jack had joined a new basketball league, and Marcus, surprisingly, had started a consulting business from home, something he'd always wanted to do but had never felt confident enough to attempt. One evening, while Sarah was unpacking boxes in the kitchen, Marcus came in holding his laptop. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Brad Henderson emailed me." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "What?" "He's selling his house. Diane left him. Apparently, the stress of his recovery and the way she'd handled everything during his hospitalization. They just couldn't recover from it. He's moving to be closer to his sister in another state." Sarah absorbed this information. Diane had left Brad. The marriage that had been held up as an example of suburban success had crumbled. "Is he okay?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with the question. "I think so. He sounds different, humbler. He apologized in the email, really apologized. Said he'd been reflecting on how he'd treated people in the neighborhood, how the power had corrupted him, how the accident had been a wake-up call." Sarah nodded slowly. Brad was leaving Westbrook. The playground bully had been defeated by circumstance, by his own vulnerability, by the things he couldn't control, and he was moving on. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked. "I said I forgave him, that I hoped he found what he was looking for in his next place." "Did you mean it?" Marcus considered the question. "I think so. I also meant it as a lesson to myself. That's not who I want to be, caught up in hierarchies and judgment and all of that." Sarah kissed him. Good. Later that week, Sarah got a message from Patricia Liang, the neighbor who had avoided her at the grocery store. Patricia had reached out via Facebook wanting to reconnect. They had coffee, and Patricia apologized for having abandoned her during the conflict. She explained the social pressure, the way the neighborhood operated, how she'd been afraid of being ostracized by association. Sarah forgave her too, not because it was easy, but because holding on to the resentment was a kind of poison, a way of remaining connected to a place she'd left. The truth was that Westbrook had taught Sarah something valuable, that belonging often came at a cost, that communities could be beautiful or vicious or both simultaneously, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away. She'd considered draining the Hendersons' pool. She'd stood at the threshold of becoming someone who destroyed things out of spite, but she'd stepped back. She'd chosen differently, and that choice more than anything was what had saved her. The pool at her new house was modest, just a basic rectangle with a solar cover. Emma and Jack loved it just the same. They swam on summer afternoons, splashing and laughing, with no sense that they were performing a privilege, with no awareness that someone might be judging them for it. Sarah would sit on the deck and watch them, and she would feel a kind of peace that she hadn't known was possible. Not the peace of victory, not the peace of revenge accomplished, but the peace of simply being allowed to exist without constant scrutiny, to love her family without weaponizing that love against others. That was enough.